Hello, hello, everyone. I'm excited to be back for chapter number 3. Before we get going there, just got to recap really quickly on what happened in the previous chapter 2, which is pretty simple because it's in the title. We've got flapjacks, hats, salesman, and a stump. So first, flapjacks or pancakes. Start family and Shane had a wonderful morning breakfast, wholesome chatting together, and they had some flapjacks, some tasty pancakes made by Marion. I'm not even a fan of pancakes myself, but the way they were described and just the excitement there, I think I would have been digging in myself. Now, hats, what's that all about? Well, Marion starts asking Shane some questions about the clothing. Joe's looking around like, why are you asking? What are you guys talking about clothing? That type of thing. But she's curious. She thinks Shane, because probably his own style, would know a little bit about what's in, what's looking cool, what's fashionable along his journeys in different states in America. So she starts asking him stuff about clothing, hats. He gives her a little bit of insight and they have this conversation. Salesman is at some point during the day, a traveling salesman comes by to sell some stuff. Again, not like Amazon that just delivers to your door. These are salesmen that bring their goods with them. And Joe wants something he has. And he's about to buy it, or at least he's, in the midst of it. And Shane calls out the salesman on maybe trying to rip Joe off a little bit, charge too much. Salesman's not too happy, starts laying into Shane a little bit, talking trash. Now, back in these days, I don't even like today. Some people, you talk trash, they want to fight. Shane remains cool. And I think partly by actually leaving to go grab an axe at some point, not to take this guy out or get in a fight, but to go hit that stump. So now he's, taking that axe and just nailing at that stump there on the Start farm. Once Joe's done with this salesman, he basically says, hey, they agree on a price. So they're trading together in a fair trade. And then he says, get off my land. And then Joe goes, grabs a bigger axe and starts going at the same routes along the way to get at that stump. And Bob is kind of looking on in admiration at these two men going at it. And I'm kind of reading the book going, yeah, I like this. I like these guys like just hammered away together. And there's just this feeling of bond or brotherhood going at this thing. So that's where we're hopping in. And we were on chapter 3. Boom. It was exciting at first watching them. They were hitting at a fast pace, making the chips dance. I thought maybe each one would cut through a root now and stomp. But Shane finished his and looked over at Father working steadily away, and with a grim little smile pulling at his mouth, he moved on to another root. A few moments later, Father smashed through his with a blow that sent the axe head into the ground beneath. He wrestled with the handle to yank the head loose, and he too tackled another root without even waiting to wipe off the dirt. This began to look like a long session, so I started to wander away. Just as I headed around the corner of the barn, Mother came past the corner. She was the freshest, prettiest thing I had ever seen. She had taken her hat and stripped the old ribbon from it and fixed it as Shane had told her. Some of the flowers by the house were in a small bouquet in front. She had cut slits in the brim, and the sash from her best dress came around the crown and through the slits and was tied in a perky bow under her chin. She was stepping along daintily, mighty proud of herself. She went up close to the stump. Those two choppers were so busy and intent that even if they were aware she was there, they did not really notice her. Well, she said, aren't you going to look at me? They both stopped and they both stared at her. Have I got it right? She asked Shane. Is this the way they do it? Yes, ma'am, he said. About like that. Only their brims are wider. And he swung back to his route. Joe Sterrett, said Mother, aren't you at least going to tell me whether you like me in this hat? Looky here, Marion, said Father. You know darn well that whether you have a hat on or whether you don't have a hat on, you're the nicest thing to me that ever happened on God's green earth. Now stop bothering us. Can't you see we're busy? And he swung back to his route. Mother's face was a deep pink. She pulled the bow out and the hat from her head. She held it swinging from her hand by the sash ends. Her hair was mussed and she was really mad. she said. This is a funny kind of resting you're doing today. Father set the axe head on the ground and leaned on the handle. Maybe it seems funny to you, Marion, but this is the best resting I've had for about as long as I can remember. Said Mother again. You have to quit your resting for a while anyhow and do what I suppose you'll call work. Dinner's hot on the stove and waiting to be served. So it's interesting that Joe is considering this work, which if you've ever gone at anything with an axe that really needs to be cut, this is like you're sweating. I mean, it's serious. And this sounds like crazy stump with roots. And he's saying this is a break. I think there's partially just a sense with these two men just enjoying seeing the other one just go at it. Like you've met somebody who's kind of like, wow, I can be impressed by this guy. If you've ever read the Epic of Gilgamesh or heard of it, there's a kid's version that I love, but it's that kind of like awe or looking at somebody and admiring a friend. So, women could have the same thing with a friend of theirs. Men in this case, I think it has a lot to do with not just somebody's spirit or character, but also like, wow, I feel like that's a tough guy. And it's kind of cool to see. At least I'll speak from my own sense as a man here. It's kind of cool to see when you see another man who you admire intellectually as a character, but also like he's going at it. So I think that's what's going on here. And it's giving Joe a peace. And he says, I'm at rest. And Marion's like, anywho. So that's kind of my context reading this. She flounced around and went straight back to the house. I should note also that, I think Joe is a little bit oblivious about the importance to some women about, hey, I would say most women, but that's me judging again. The importance of looking pretty and being recognized for looking pretty. I know this. I imagine I could be working out of my house. My wife comes out and she's looking pretty. I'm like, oh, I'm doing work. But to recognize the beauty in another person, I think it's important. And Marion's like, these men aren't recognizing me. So I think that's more context. Anyhow, she flounced around and went straight back to the house. We all tagged her in and to an uncomfortable meal. Mother always believed you should be decent and polite at mealtime, particularly with company. She was polite enough now. She was being especially sweet, talking enough for the whole table of us without once saying a word about her hat lying where she had thrown it on the chair by the stove. The trouble was that she was too polite. She was trying too hard to be sweet. As far as you could tell, though, the two men were not worried by her at all. They listened absently to her talk, chiming in when she asked them direct questions, but otherwise keeping quiet. Their minds were on that old stump and whatever it was that old stump had come to mean to them, and they were in a hurry to get at it again. After they had gone out and I had been helping Mother with the dishes a while, she began humming low under her breath, and I knew she was not mad anymore. She was too curious and puzzled to have room for anything else. What went on out there, Bob? She asked me. What got into those two? I did not rightly know. All I could do was try to tell her about Ledyard, the traveling salesman, and how our visitor had called him on the cultivator. I must have used the wrong words because when I told her about Ledyard talking mean and the way Shane acted, she got all flushed and excited. What do you say, Bob? Were you afraid of him? He frightened you? Your father would never let him do that. I wasn't frightened of him, I said, struggling to make her see the difference. I was just frightened. I was scared of whatever it was that might happen. She reached out and rumpled my hair. I think I understand, she said softly. He's made me feel a little that way too. She went to the window and stared toward the barn. The steady rhythm of double blows, so together they sounded almost as one, was faint yet clear in the kitchen. I hope Joe knows what he's doing, she murmured to herself. Then she turned to me. Skip along, Bob. I'll finish myself. So we've got something deeper going on here, kind of under the surface. I think, Bob kind of feels it. Marion has a better sense. I'm not sure about Joe completely, but Shane seems like, you don't know what's going to happen. There's this real mysteriousness about him, and he's also a pretty tough guy. So there's something going on underneath, right? It was no fun watching them now. They had eased down to a slow, dogged pace. Father sent me once for the hone so they could sharpen the blades, and again for a spade so he could clear the dirt away from the lowest roots. And I realized he might keep me running as long as I was handy. I slipped off by myself to see how Mother's garden was doing after the rain and maybe add to the population in the box of worms I was collecting for when I would go fishing with the boys in town. I took my time about it. I played pretty far afield, but no matter where I went, always I could hear that chopping in the distance. You could not help beginning to feel tired just to hear it, to think how they were working and staying at it. Along the middle of the afternoon, I wandered into the barn. There was Mother by the rear stall, up on a box, peering through the little window above it. She hopped down as soon as she had heard me and put a finger to her lips. I declare, she whispered, in some ways, those two aren't even as old as you are, Bob. Just the same. She frowned at me in such a funny, confiding manner that I felt all warm inside. Don't you dare tell them I said so. But there's something splendid in the battle they're giving that old monster. She went past me and toward the house with such a brisk air that I followed to see what she was going to do. She whisked about the kitchen, and in almost no time at all, she had a pan of biscuits in the oven. While they were baking, she took her hat and carefully sewed the old ribbon into its old place. Humph, she said, more to herself than to me. You'd think I'd learn. This isn't Dodge City. This isn't even a whistle stop. It's Joe Starrett's farm. It's where I'm proud to be. Maybe I'll stop here briefly and just say there can sometimes be a conflict among people. I would include myself at times between getting a bunch of nice things, fancy clothing, nice cars, and so forth, and then just living casually, being around friends, family, enjoying conversation and not worrying about these, super nice things. And there can be a battle between these two. And I think Marion is somewhat having this. So I think like with Dodge City would be like New York City, like a big city where you'd get dressed up and it's fancy. And then you've got the star at home. That's kind of, it's a farm. I mean, you make your own stuff, you build your own house, and it's much more chill. It's home like, it's family, but there's not that ritz and wealth. So I think Marion's got a little bit of a struggle, but she's like, what was I thinking, getting all fancy and so forth? I love this place. I love these people. I'm in such a good mood, that type of feeling. I don't know if you've ever had that. I have definitely experienced that. It's an interesting conflict to have and think about. All right. Out came the biscuits. She piled as many as she could on a plate, popping one of the leftovers into her mouth and giving me the rest. She picked up the plate and marched with it out behind the barn. She stepped over the cut roots and set the plate on a fairly smooth spot on top of the stump. She looked at the two men, first one and then the other. You're a pair of fools, she said. But there's no law against me being a fool, too. Without looking at either of them again, she marched away, her head high, back toward the house. The two of them stared after her till she was out of sight. They turned to stare at the biscuits. Father gave a deep sigh, so deep it seemed to come all the way from his heavy work shoes. There was nothing sad or sorrowful about it. There was just something in him too big to be held tight in comfort. He let his axe fall to the ground. He leaned forward and separated the biscuits into two piles beside the plate, counting them even. One was left on the plate. He set this by itself on the stump. He took up his axe and reached it out and let it drop gently on the lone biscuit exactly in the middle. He rested the axe against the stump and took the two halves of the biscuit and put one on each pile. He did not say a word to Shane. He pitched into one pile and Shane did into the other, and the two of them faced each other over those last uncut roots, munching at those biscuits as if eating them was the most serious business they had ever done. Father finished his pile and dabbled his fingers on the plate for the last crumbs. He straightened and stretched his arms high and wide. He seemed to stretch and stretch until he was a tremendous tower of strength reaching up into the late afternoon sun. He swooped suddenly to grab the plate and toss it to me. Still in the same movement, he seized the axe and swung it in a great arc into the root he was working on. Quick as he was, Shane was right with him, and together they were talking again to that old stump. So Marion kind of did her own contribution to this stump by supplying the tasty biscuits. I took the plate into Mother. She was peeling apples in the kitchen, humming gaily to herself. "The wood box, Bob," she said, and went on humming. I carried in stove lengths till the box would not hold any more. Then I slipped out before she might think of more chores. I tried to keep myself busy down by the river, skipping flat stones across the current, all muddy still from the rain. I was able to do for a while, but that steady chopping had a peculiar fascination. It was always pulling me toward the barn. I simply could not grasp how they could stick it out hour after hour. It made no sense to me why they should work so when routing out that old stump was not really so important. I was wavering in front of the barn when I noticed that the chopping was different. Only one axe was working. I heard around back. Shane was still swinging, cutting into the last root. Father was using the spade, was digging under one side of the stump, bringing the dirt out between the cut roots. As I watched, he laid the spade aside and put his shoulder to the stump, kind of like leaning into it. He heaved against it. Sweat started to pour down his face. There was a little sucking sound and the stump moved ever so slightly. That did it. Of a sudden, I was so excited that I could hear my own blood pounding past my eardrums. I wanted to dash to that stump and push it and feel it move. Only I knew Father would think I was in the way. Shane finished the root and came to help him. Together, they heaved against the stump. It angled up nearly a whole inch. I mean, imagine it's moving like that much. That's it. This is a massive stump. You could begin to see an open space in the dirt where it was ripping loose. But as soon as they released the pressure, it fell back. Again and again, they heaved at it. Each time it would angle up a bit farther. Each time it would fall back. They had it up once about 1.5 feet, and that was the limit. They could not get past it. They stopped, breathing hard, mighty streak down now from the sweat rivulets down their faces. That sounded weird. Let me read that again. They stopped, breathing hard, mighty streaked now from the sweat rivulets down their faces. That's a strange sentence. I'm going to keep going, but that's a strange sentence. Father peered underneath as best he could. "Must be a taproot," he said. That was the one time either of them had spoken to the other, as far as I knew, the whole afternoon through. Father did not say anything more, and Shane said nothing. He just picked up his axe and looked at Father and waited. Father began to shake his head. There was some unspoken thought between them that bothered him. He looked down at his own big hands, and slowly the fingers curled until they were clenched into big fists. Then his head stopped shaking and he stood taller and he drew a deep breath. He turned and backed in between two cut root ends, pressing against the stump. He pushed his feet into the ground for firm footholds. He bent his knees and slid his shoulders down the stump and wrapped his big hands around the root ends. Slowly he began to straighten. Slowly that huge stump began to rise. Up it came, inch by inch, until the side was all the way up to the limit they had reached before. I want to stop here and note that it seemed for a moment there might have almost been an excuse to stop. That, when Joe said, "Must be a taproot," something like, there's something going on here that makes it too hard for us to really accomplish, and we can go take a break or something like that. There's the hint of that. But I think the fact that Joe's got Shane there and he's looking at Shane, you've got somebody you look up to, admire as a friend, as just somebody who's kind of dope generally. You don't want to let that person down. And then you start to get a feeling of more kind of like, I can do this in yourself. So there's something super admirable about Shane. And it motivates Joe. And I think the reverse is true too. Shane seeing Joe go at it motivates Shane. So it's this kind of reciprocal dual thing going on. So they're going to keep at it. Shane stooped to peer under. He poked his axe into the opening and I heard it strike wood. But the only way he could get in position to swing the axe into the opening was to drop on his right knee and extend his left leg and thigh into the opening and lean his weight on them. Then he could bring the axe sweeping in at a low angle close to the ground. So he would have his foot and his thigh in the hole that root could fall back on him, basically, is what's happening here. He flashed one quick glance at Father beside and behind him, eyes closed, muscles locked in that great sustained effort, and he dropped into position with the whole terrible weight of the stump poised above nearly half of his body and sent the axe sweeping under his swift, powerful strokes. So now Shane is putting basically his life in Joe's hands, because if Joe, he's leaning into that root, if he stops and that root goes back, I mean, that's basically the end of Shane. Suddenly, possibly, I mean, he could be very, very injured, seriously injured. And there's no ER next to the star at home, you know. Suddenly, Father seemed to slip. Only he had not slipped. He had straightened even further. The stump had leaped up a few more inches. Shane jumped out and up and tossed his axe aside. He grabbed one of the root ends and helped Father ease the stump down. They both were blowing like they had run a long way, but they would not stay more than a minute before they were heaving again at the stump. It came up more easily now, and the dirt was tearing loose all around it. I ran to the house as fast as I could. I dashed into the kitchen and took hold of Mother's hands. "Hurry," I yelled. You've got to come." She did not seem to want to come at first, and I pulled her. "You've got to see it. They're getting it out." Then she was as excited as I was and was running right with me. They had the stump way up at a high angle. They were down in the hole, one on each side of it, pushing up and forward with hands flat on the underpart, reared before them, higher than their heads. You would have thought the stump was ready to topple over, clear of its ancient foundation. But there it stuck. They could not quite push it the final inches. Mother watching them battling with it. "Joe," she called, "why don't you use some sense? Hitch up the team. Horses will have it out in no time at all." Father braced himself to hold the stump still. He turned his head to look at her. "Horses?" he shouted. All the pent silence of the two of them that long afternoon through was being shattered in one wonderful shout. "Horses? Great jumping Jehoshaphat. No, we started this with manpower, and by Godfrey, we will finish it with manpower." He turned his head to face the stump once more and dropped it lower between his humped shoulders. Shane opposite him stiffened, and together they pushed in a fresh assault. The stump quivered and swayed a little and hung fixed as its crazy high angle. Father grunted in exasperation. You could see the strength building up in his legs and broad shoulders and big corded arms. His side of the upturned stump rocked forward, and Shane's side moved back, and the whole stump trembled like it would twist down and into the hole on them at a grotesque new angle. I wanted to shout a warning, but I could not speak, for Shane had thrown his head in a quick sideways gesture to fling his hair from falling over his face, and I had caught a glimpse of his eyes. They were aflame with a concentrated cold fire. Not another separate discernible movement did he make. It was all of him, the whole man pulsing in one incredible surge of power. You could fairly feel the fierce energy suddenly burning in him, pouring through him in the single coordinated drive. His side of the stump rocked forward even with Father's, and the whole mass of the stump tore loose from the last hold and toppled away to sprawl in ungainly defeat beyond them. Father climbed slowly out of the hole. He walked to the stump and placed a hand on the rounded bowl, or the kind of trunk, and patted it like it was an old friend, and he was perhaps a little sorry for it. Shane was with him. Across from him, laying a hand gently on the old hard wood. They both looked up and their eyes met and held as they had so long ago in the morning hours. The silence should have been complete. It was not if it was not because someone was shouting, a high-pitched, wordless shout. I realized the voice was mine and I closed my mouth. The silence was clean and wholesome. And this was one of the things you could never forget, whatever time might do to you in the furrowing or wrinkling of the years. An old stump on its side with root ends making a strange pattern against the glow of the sun sinking behind the far mountains, and the two men looking over into each other's eyes. I thought they should join the hands so close on the bowl of the stump. I thought they should at least say something to each other. They stood quiet and motionless. At last, Father turned and came toward Mother. He was so tired that the weariness showed in his walk, but there was no weariness in his voice. Marion, he said, I'm rested now. I don't believe any man since the world began was ever more rested. Shane, too, was coming toward us. He, too, spoke only to Mother. Ma'am, I've learned something today. Being a farmer has more to it than I ever thought. Now I'm about ready for some of that pie. Mother had been watching them in a wide-eyed wonder. At his last words, she let out a positive wail. Huh? You men! You made me forget about it. It's probably all burned. And she was running for the house so fast she was tripping over her skirt. The pie was burned all right. We could smell it when we were in front of the house and the men were scrubbing themselves at the pump trough. Mother had the door open to let the kitchen air out. The noises from inside sounded as if she might be throwing things around. Kettles were banging and dishes were clattering. When we went in, we saw why. She had the table set and was putting supper on it, and she was grabbing the things from their places and putting them down on the table with solid thumps. She would not look at one of us. We sat down and waited for her to join us. She put her back to us and stood by the low shelf near the stove, staring at her big pie tin and the burned stuff in it. Finally, Father spoke kind of sharply. Look here, Marion. Aren't you ever going to sit down? She whirled and glared at him. I thought maybe she had been crying, but there were no tears on her face. It was dry and pinched looking, and there was no color in it. Her voice was sharp like Father's. I was planning to have a deep dish apple pie. Well, I will. None of your silly man foolishness is going to stop me. She swept up the big tin and went out the door with it. We heard her on the steps, and a few seconds later, the rattle of the cover of the garbage pail. We heard her on the steps again. She came in and went to the side bench where the dishpan was and began to scrub the pie tin. The way she acted, we might have never been in the room. Father's face was getting red. He picked up his fork to begin eating, and I let it drop with a clear clatter. He squirmed on his chair and kept taking quick side looks at her. She finished scrubbing the tin and went to the apple barrel and filled her wooden bowl with fat round ones. She sat by the stove and started peeling them. Father fished in a pocket and pulled out his old jackknife. He moved over to her, stepping softly. He reached out for an apple to help her. She did not look up, but her voice caught him like she had flicked him with a whip. Joe Starrett, don't you dare touch one of these apples. He was sheepish as he returned to his chair. Then he was downright mad. He grabbed his knife and fork and dug into the food on his plate, taking big bites and chewing vigorously. There was nothing for our visitor and me to do but follow his example. Maybe it was a good supper. I could not tell. The food was only something to put in your mouth. And when we finished, there was nothing to do but wait because Mother was sitting by the stove, arms folded, staring at the wall, waiting herself for her pie to bake. I want to pause here and say that I think there are some people out here that, and I've seen this, will mock this book because it's like, oh, big deal. This woman her pie got burnt. So I think you'll either have some, manly men who are like, oh, who cares? Who gives a damn if this woman's baking a pie? I don't care. Or you'll have people that mock kind of I'm just going to call it like femininity, or this sense that I want to make something or bake something nice for these men who just did all this work. I'm going to do my work. Like the equivalent of hitting at that stump is her baking this pie, and it got messed up. So it's kind of like Joe and Shane are out there. They're not stopping. They're going to take out that root and they're going to get it until it's done. That stump is gone, or at least it's out the ground. And Marion's feeling the same way about her work, which happens to be pie at this time. So I don't think there's anything to mock here. I think it's pretty badass, actually, of her to keep at it. Now, I know the tenseness of this because I've had this experience, my own wife, and I've seen it before, and I can get worked up if something doesn't go right. So personally, I think this is great where she's doing her thing, but I just wanted to note that there will be people out there that mock this, like, oh, the woman in her kitchen baking her pie while the men are doing their hard. It's like both of these work are important, at least in my view. They each have their place. I just went on a tangent. My apologies. I'll hop back in. We three watched her in a quiet so tight that it hurt. We could not help it. We would try to look away, and always our eyes would turn back to her. She did not appear to notice us. She might have said she had forgotten we were there. She had not forgotten, because as soon as she sensed that the pie was done, she lifted it out, cut 4 wide pieces, and put them on plates. The first 2 she set in front of the 2 men. The third one she set down for me. The last one she laid at her own place, and she sat down in her own chair at the table. Her voice was still sharp. Sorry to keep you men waiting so long. Your pie is ready now. Father inspected his portion like he was afraid of it. He needed to make a real effort to take his fork and lift a piece. He chewed on it and swallowed, and he flipped his eyes sideways at Mother and back again quickly to look across the table at Shane. That's prime pie, he said. Shane raised the piece on his fork. He considered it closely. He put it in his mouth and chewed on it gravely. Yes, he said. The quizzical expression on his face was so plain you could not possibly miss it. Yes, that's the best bit of stump I ever tasted. What could a silly remark like that mean? I had no time to wonder, for Father and Mother were acting so queer. They both stared at Shane and their mouths were sagging open. Then Father snapped his shut and he chuckled and chuckled till he was swaying in his chair. By Gottfried, Marion, he's right. You've done it too. Mother stared from one to the other of them. Her pinched look faded and her cheeks were flushed and her eyes were soft and warm as they should be. And she was laughing so that the tears came. And all of us were pitching into that pie. And the one thing wrong in the whole world was that there was not enough of it. That's the end of chapter 3. So again, we've got such a loving ending here, each of them kind of going at their own battles. And that's why I think, imagine you understand this to some extent, or maybe fully. Like I was saying, Shane is calling it her own little stump. Like, this is the best stump I've ever had. Because it's kind of like them going at the stump outside, and that was her stump, was making that pie after it got burnt. So I think I talked enough during that chapter, so I'm not gonna say much more here. I think we're just gonna go straight to the face. So let's do Marion when she realizes that the pie is burnt. So she's out there just in awe that these guys have gotten up this stump, which it really seemed impossible early on. So if I was there and I was seeing, I think, oh, there's no way this stump is ever going to get out. Like, it's that big. And now they got it out, these 2 men. So Marion's staring, like, wow. But then she realizes that the pie is in the oven, so it's probably burnt. So I want a face of Marion when that moment she realizes that. Okay, I'm gonna give you mine. Let me see what I got. Let me get ready for it. Okay. Maybe that was over exaggerated. I don't know. I can't see myself because I'm trying to look right in the camera so I can kind of look eye contact with you guys. Hope it worked out. Hope you guys do a face. Get in that mirror, get your face right. I gotta see mine. I'm gonna look at this video again. Fun being with you guys. We'll see you next weekend, or whatever day this happens to be for you, for Shane Chapter 4. Adios, everyone.